For years, you've heard about forgiveness. Churches preach it, self-help books recommend it, therapists suggest it. But Joel Goldsmith discovered something revolutionary that changes everything you thought you knew. True forgiveness isn't what you've been taught. It's not about forcing yourself to accept the unacceptable or pretending hurt never happened. What Goldsmith revealed through deep mystical practice is this: real forgiveness happens when you understand there was never anything to forgive in the first place. This isn't denial. This is seeing through the illusion of separation to the truth of spiritual reality. When you grasp this, physical healing begins, relationships transform, and your entire life shifts. The secret lies in recognizing that what appeared as harm was simply human consciousness operating in ignorance of its divine nature. Every person who ever hurt you was acting from a limited state of awareness, not from their true spiritual self. This understanding doesn't excuse behavior, it transcends it entirely. Jesus taught forgiveness from a dimension most people never reach. He didn't say forgive because it's morally right or because you should be nice. He taught forgiveness because he saw reality as it truly is, beyond the material appearance. When he said forgive 70 times 7, he meant keep returning to spiritual truth until you see only God's presence. Goldsmith spent decades penetrating this mystery. He discovered that unforgiveness keeps you bound to the past, not through guilt, but through continuing to give reality to an illusion. Every time you rehearse your grievance, you breathe life into something that has no power except what you give it. This is the invisible chain that blocks healing and abundance. The moment you truly understand forgiveness as Jesus taught it, something remarkable happens in your consciousness. The past loses its grip. The person who hurt you is suddenly seen in an entirely different light, not as your enemy, but as another expression of divine life struggling through human limitation. Most people practice what Goldsmith called personal sense forgiveness. This is where you, as a person, try to forgive another person for their actions. This keeps the entire drama alive. You remain the victim, they remain the villain, and forgiveness becomes a heroic struggle. But this isn't the forgiveness that heals. True forgiveness happens when you rise above personal sense entirely. You stop seeing yourself as a vulnerable human body that can be harmed. You stop seeing others as separate powers that can hurt you. Instead, you recognize one infinite consciousness expressing itself through infinite forms. From this altitude, what is there to forgive? This is not spiritual bypassing or avoiding real pain. This is entering the consciousness where pain dissolves because you see its unreality. Goldsmith proved this through countless healings. Physical conditions that doctors called permanent disappeared when the patient stopped holding grievances and entered the consciousness of divine oneness. Here's the practice that changes everything. When someone hurts you or when past pain surfaces, pause. Don't try to forgive them. Instead, turn within and recognize this truth. God is the only power, the only presence, the only reality. Nothing opposed to God's nature can have real existence. Whatever appeared as harm was appearance only, not reality. Then take the second step. Recognize that the person before you, regardless of their actions, is spiritual being having a human experience. They are not their behavior. They are not their unconscious choices. At their core, they are the same divine consciousness you are. When you see this, forgiveness isn't something you do. It's something that happens naturally. Practice this daily, especially with small irritations. Don't wait for major trauma. Train your consciousness to immediately return to spiritual truth whenever anything disturbs your peace. Over weeks and months, this becomes automatic. Your consciousness transforms, and with it, your entire experience of life transforms. Let me share what happened to Margaret, a woman who attended Goldsmith's classes in the 1950s. She carried a devastating burden. Her sister had betrayed her in a business venture, costing Margaret her life savings and nearly destroying her marriage. For 3 years, Margaret tried every form of forgiveness she knew. She prayed, she went to therapy, she even confronted her sister. Nothing released the pain. The resentment was eating her alive, manifesting as chronic digestive problems and insomnia. Then she heard Goldsmith explain true forgiveness. He told her to stop trying to forgive her sister as one person forgiving another person. Instead, recognize that in spiritual reality, there is no sister separate from God, no betrayal separate from divine harmony. Margaret practiced this for 6 weeks. Every time anger rose, she didn't fight it or feel guilty about it. She simply returned to the truth. God is the only presence. Gradually, something shifted. The anger didn't just diminish, it transformed into understanding. She saw her sister's actions came from fear and ignorance, not evil. More remarkably, her digestive issues resolved completely. Within 3 months, Margaret reported a miracle. Not only was she free from resentment, but her sister reached out with a genuine apology and partial repayment. Goldsmith explained this wasn't coincidence. When you stop holding someone in the consciousness of wrongdoer, you release them to find their own spiritual truth. Then there was David, a war veteran who came to Goldsmith's practice carrying wounds deeper than his physical injuries. He had witnessed difficult situations that haunted him daily. Traditional therapy helped him function, but the nightmares persisted. The anger at what he'd seen felt justified, righteous even. How could he forgive what seemed unforgivable? Goldsmith didn't tell him to forgive the actions. He taught him something more profound, to see beyond the human scene entirely. In God's universe, there is no war, no cruelty, no evil. These exist only in the dream of material sense, the collective hallucination of separation from divine love. David's healing wouldn't come from forgiving evil, but from awakening to reality. For months, David practiced meditation on one truth. Only God's kingdom is real. The battlefield existed in time and space, but time and space are not ultimate reality. Consciousness is. As his consciousness shifted from human horror to divine presence, the nightmares began losing their power. Not because he forgot, but because he was seeing from a higher dimension. After a full year of practice, David experienced what he called liberation. The memories remained, but they no longer controlled him. He could speak of his experiences without being dragged back into emotional pain. He had discovered what Jesus meant when he said, "My kingdom is not of this world." David learned to live from that kingdom. Consider Rachel's story, a woman diagnosed with an autoimmune condition. Her doctors found no physical cause until a perceptive physician asked about her emotional life. Rachel revealed she harbored deep resentment toward her former business partner who had treated her unfairly for years. The doctor suggested this might be connected, but Rachel had already tried forgiving countless times without success. When Rachel found Goldsmith's teachings, she understood why traditional forgiveness hadn't worked. She had been trying to forgive from the level of personal identity, keeping the victim's story alive, even as she attempted to release it. Goldsmith's approach was radically different. Stop seeing yourself as someone who was wronged, and the other as someone who wronged you. Rachel began a daily practice. Instead of affirming, "I forgive my partner," she meditated on spiritual truth. There is no wronged person here, no wrongdoing person there, only divine consciousness expressing perfectly. This felt almost impossible at first. Her mind screamed that her pain was real, the betrayal was real. But she persisted with the practice. Over 8 months, something extraordinary happened. Her autoimmune markers began normalizing. More importantly, her relationship with her former partner transformed without them changing at all. Rachel simply stopped reacting from old wounds because she had dissolved the wounded identity itself. Her doctor called it remarkable. Rachel called it the power of seeing with Christ consciousness. Here's what medical science is beginning to confirm about what Goldsmith taught decades ago. Unforgiveness creates measurable stress in your body. It elevates cortisol, weakens immune function, and creates chronic inflammation. But here's the deeper truth. This isn't just psychological, it's spiritual. When you hold grievances, you're choosing to live in separation consciousness rather than unity consciousness. Every major spiritual tradition points to this truth, but Goldsmith made it practical and accessible. He showed that forgiveness isn't a moral commandment you struggle to obey. It's a description of what happens when you see reality clearly. In the light of divine truth, grievances simply cannot exist, because the separate powers you thought could harm you are revealed as illusion. The transformation doesn't require years of therapy or superhuman willpower. It requires a shift in perception, a willingness to see beyond material appearances to spiritual reality. When you practice this consistently, your entire energy changes. People notice you're different before you tell them anything. Your health improves, opportunities appear, Relationships heal seemingly on their own. If these transformation stories inspire you to explore Joel Goldsmith's teachings deeper, like this video to help others discover true forgiveness, subscribe for more mystical Christianity wisdom, and comment. Which story resonated most powerfully with your own healing journey? Beyond the primary practice of seeing through material sense to spiritual reality, Goldsmith taught complementary techniques that accelerate your transformation. The first is what he called spiritual listening. This isn't ordinary meditation where you try to empty your mind or visualize outcomes. This is resting in receptivity to divine wisdom, allowing truth to reveal itself to you. When you're struggling to release a grievance, spend 10 minutes in silent listening. Don't ask for help forgiving. Don't rehearse your hurt. Simply rest in the awareness that infinite intelligence is present right where you are. In this receptive state, insights come that your personal mind could never generate. You suddenly understand the other person's perspective, or you see how the situation served your growth. The second technique is what Goldsmith called treatment through recognition of presence. Throughout your day, pause frequently to recognize, God is here, right where this difficulty appears to be. Not God will fix this situation, but God is the only reality here now. This shifts you out of problem consciousness into presence consciousness. Practice this especially when someone triggers you. Your colleague makes a cutting remark, your partner disappoints you, your neighbor acts inconsiderately. Before reacting, take 3 seconds to recognize, divine love is present here, even though I'm not yet seeing it clearly. This tiny pause prevents you from adding more resentment to your consciousness. The third complementary practice is daily meditation on spiritual identity. Goldsmith emphasized that you cannot truly forgive while you still believe you're a vulnerable material being who can be genuinely harmed. Every morning, spend 5 minutes establishing your true identity. You are not a body with a soul. You are spiritual consciousness expressing through a body. Affirm these truths, not as wishful thinking, but as recognition of what is always true. I am divine life, lived by God. I am spiritual wisdom, guided from within. I am eternal consciousness, untouched by time and circumstance. As this becomes your established consciousness, forgiveness becomes natural, because you recognize nothing has power to diminish what you truly are. The fourth technique involves daily gratitude specifically focused on difficult people and situations. This sounds counterintuitive, but Goldsmith discovered it's transformative. Every evening, find something to appreciate about the person you're working to forgive. Not fake positivity, but genuine recognition that this challenge is pushing you towards spiritual awakening. Thank the situation for forcing you to deepen your practice, to discover spiritual strength you didn't know you had, to learn what cannot be learned in comfort. This isn't about being grateful for harm. It's about recognizing that everything in your experience, when met with spiritual consciousness, becomes a doorway to greater realization. Goldsmith also taught the power of impersonal forgiveness work. You don't just forgive those who hurt you personally. You practice seeing beyond appearances with everyone you encounter. The rude driver, the incompetent clerk, the difficult neighbor you deal with regularly. Each one is an opportunity to practice recognizing divine presence beyond human behavior. This trains your consciousness to automatically default to spiritual truth rather than personal judgment. When you're in the habit of seeing God's presence in strangers, it becomes natural to see it in those closest to you, even when they disappoint or hurt you. Your consciousness becomes a healing presence everywhere you go. Another powerful technique is what Goldsmith called bearing witness to the Christ in others. Regardless of what someone has done, there remains within them the divine spark, the Christ consciousness, their true spiritual identity. Your work is to bear witness to that truth even when they cannot. This isn't about ignoring harmful behavior or removing consequences. It's about maintaining your spiritual altitude regardless of another's actions. When you hold someone in the consciousness of their divine potential rather than their human failure, you become an invisible support for their transformation. Often, people change in your presence without knowing why. Your consciousness of truth about them calls them to their higher nature. The final complementary practice is maintaining what Goldsmith called the secret place of the Most High. This is a consciousness you cultivate where nothing from the outer world can disturb your inner peace. You don't build this through positive thinking or affirmations. You build it through consistent return to the truth that God is the only power. Create a daily practice of entering this secret place. Sit quietly and release every person, every situation, every concern into divine care. Not by pushing them away, but by recognizing they exist in God's universe, not in a threatening material world. As you do this day after day, you develop an unshakable core of peace. From this place of peace, forgiveness isn't work. It's simply how you naturally see everyone and everything. You've trained your consciousness to rest in spiritual reality rather than material appearances. Hurts still happen, disappointments still come, but they no longer penetrate to your core because your core rests in eternal truth. These complementary practices, used together with the primary principle of seeing beyond material sense to spiritual reality, create a transformation that goes far beyond releasing specific grievances. You become a different person, living from a different dimension of consciousness. This is the promise of Joel Goldsmith's practical mysticism, the fulfillment of what Jesus taught. Now let's address the challenges you'll face, because Goldsmith never promised this would be easy at first. The primary obstacle is what he called the resistance of personal sense. Your human identity doesn't want to dissolve. It will insist your hurt is real, your grievance is justified. The person who harmed you deserves judgment. This resistance is normal. When it arises, don't fight it and don't feel guilty about it. Simply recognize it for what it is, the voice of material sense trying to maintain its dominance. Return gently to truth. You're not suppressing your feelings. You're choosing which lens you'll look through, the material or the spiritual. With practice, the spiritual lens becomes natural. The second major challenge is what Goldsmith called the bootless cry. This is when you practice these principles but don't see immediate results. You're meditating on divine presence, but you still feel angry. You're recognizing spiritual identity, but your body still hurts. You're tempted to conclude this doesn't work and return to conventional forgiveness or just holding grievances. This is the critical moment. Goldsmith taught that spiritual realization operates differently than material cause and effect. There's often a lag between the shift in consciousness and the manifestation in experience. The transformation is happening in the invisible before it becomes visible. Your work is to persist in truth, regardless of appearances, trusting the process. Another common obstacle is the guilt that arises when you can't sustain the elevated consciousness. You have a breakthrough, you feel free, you see with spiritual vision. Then something triggers you, and you're back in anger and resentment. You feel like you've failed, like you're not spiritual enough. Goldsmith addressed this directly. You're not trying to be perfect, you're learning a new way of seeing. Think of it like learning a language. You don't expect to speak fluently after a few lessons. You practice, you make mistakes, you practice more. Gradually, the new language becomes natural. It's the same with spiritual consciousness. Each time you catch yourself in resentment and consciously return to truth, you're strengthening the spiritual muscle. The challenge of dealing with ongoing harm is particularly difficult. What if you're practicing forgiveness while someone continues to hurt you? Goldsmith was clear. Spiritual practice doesn't mean remaining in harmful situations. You can recognize someone's divine identity while also setting firm boundaries, leaving relationships, or seeking protection. True forgiveness coexists with wise action. You forgive by seeing beyond their behavior to their spiritual reality, but you respond to their behavior with practical wisdom. Jesus forgave those who crucified him, but he also told his disciples to shake the dust off their feet and leave towns that rejected them. Forgiveness is spiritual, boundaries are practical, both are necessary. Many people struggle with the challenge of forgiving themselves, which Goldsmith considered the deepest work. You can see divine presence in others but remain convinced of your own unworthiness. The guilt and shame you carry about your own past mistakes can be more paralyzing than anything others did to you. This requires the same principle applied inward. Stop seeing yourself as a person who made terrible mistakes and needs forgiveness. Instead, recognize that the one who made those choices was operating in limited consciousness, not from your true spiritual self. This isn't about escaping responsibility. It's about understanding that your identity was never separate from God, even when you were unaware of it. Practice this specifically. When memories of your failures arise, Don't rehearse the story. Don't wallow in guilt or try to convince yourself you're forgiven. Simply return to truth. God is the only presence, the only power, the only reality. The identity that failed exists only in limited material sense. Your true self, spiritual and eternal, never sinned because it never left divine perfection. This feels impossible at first because self-condemnation runs so deep. But persist. Every time shame surfaces, use it as a signal to return to spiritual identity. Over time, months, or even years, the burden lifts. Not because you've earned forgiveness, but because you've awakened to the truth that you were never actually separate from divine love. The final major obstacle is maintaining your practice when life gets overwhelming. When you're stressed, tired, or dealing with crisis, it's easy to abandon spiritual principles and react from pure emotion. Goldsmith understood this. He taught that your daily practice in peaceful times builds the consciousness that sustains you in difficult times. This is why consistency matters more than intensity. 10 minutes daily of genuine spiritual practice builds stronger consciousness than occasional hours of desperate prayer. You're establishing a foundation that becomes automatic. When crisis hits, your trained consciousness responds with truth before your emotions can take over completely. Don't aim for perfection. Aim for return. You'll forget, you'll react, you'll fall back into old patterns. The victory is in how quickly you recognize it and return to spiritual truth. Each return strengthens the pathway. Eventually, the return happens almost instantaneously. You feel anger rising and immediately remember, this is material sense, not spiritual reality. One practical tip for overcoming all these obstacles: find community with others practicing these principles. Goldsmith students formed study groups where they supported each other through challenges. When your practice wavers, another's strength lifts you. When someone else struggles, your practice supports them. This is how spiritual consciousness multiplies and strengthens. If these obstacle-breaking insights empower you to persist in your spiritual practice, like this video to support transformative content, subscribe for advanced Joel Goldsmith teachings, and comment, which challenge resonates most with your current journey? Now let's explore advanced integration of these principles into specific life situations, starting with family dynamics. Sarah had been practicing Goldsmith's forgiveness work for over a year with remarkable results in most areas of her life. But every family gathering triggered old wounds with her father. Despite her practice, she still felt criticized and dismissed in his presence. Goldsmith would say this is where the rubber meets the road. Family relationships are the ultimate test because they formed your earliest patterns of consciousness. The key is recognizing that you're not actually dealing with your father. You're dealing with your own consciousness about your father, the identity patterns formed decades ago that replay automatically. Sarah learned to prepare spiritually before family visits. She spent several days beforehand in meditation, establishing the truth. Her father is a spiritual being, expressing perfectly even when humanly he appears critical. More importantly, she is not the person he thinks she is, or even the person she thinks she is in his presence. She is divine consciousness itself. The breakthrough came when Sarah stopped trying to change her father, or even change her reaction to him. Instead, she rested in knowing that the whole drama existed in material sense only. In spiritual reality, there was only perfect divine relationship. She maintained this consciousness silently throughout visits. Gradually, incredibly, her father's behavior shifted without her saying a word about it. James applied these principles in the workplace where he faced a supervisor who seemed determined to undermine him. For months, James had tried conventional forgiveness, telling himself his boss was doing his best, trying to see his perspective. Nothing changed except James developed stress-related health issues from suppressing anger. When James discovered Goldsmith's approach, he realized he'd been trying to improve the human picture rather than see beyond it. He stopped focusing on his boss's behavior and began a practice of recognizing divine order governing his career. Not divine order that would punish his boss or get him promoted, but recognition that infinite intelligence was present right where the conflict appeared. This is crucial to understand. You're not using spiritual truth to manipulate outcomes. You're aligning with truth and allowing whatever needs to happen to unfold. James maintained his practice for 3 months while also updating his resume and setting clear professional boundaries. He wasn't passively accepting mistreatment in the name of spirituality. What happened surprised everyone. His supervisor was transferred to another department for reasons unrelated to James. His replacement immediately recognized James's contributions, but more significantly, James noticed he was no longer vulnerable to workplace dynamics in the same way. He developed an inner stability that didn't depend on external approval or fair treatment. Consider Maria's situation with health professionals after a medical misdiagnosis caused significant harm. She had legitimate grounds for disappointment and concern, but her attorney noticed the ongoing stress was affecting her physically and emotionally, undermining her well-being. Traditional stress management techniques barely helped. Then Maria found Goldsmith's work through a friend. The challenge was enormous. How do you practice forgiveness while simultaneously pursuing accountability? Goldsmith's answer: forgiveness is a state of consciousness, not a course of action. Maria could recognize her doctor's spiritual identity while still addressing professional concerns. These operate on different planes entirely. Maria practiced a specific technique. Before meetings with attorneys or thinking about her case, she spent 10 minutes in what Goldsmith called treatment. She recognized that only divine intelligence actually governed health, and that material medicine, while useful, had no ultimate power. This wasn't denial of what happened. It was placing it in proper perspective. The result was remarkable. Maria proceeded with her case, but without the consuming frustration that had been draining her. She could discuss medical details calmly, make clear decisions, and when she ultimately reached a fair resolution, she felt relief rather than vindication. The situation was addressed properly, but Maria was free from the emotional burden because she'd maintained her spiritual altitude throughout. Then there's the advanced practice of what Goldsmith called redeeming the past. Thomas carried difficult memories from his college years when a trusted mentor had betrayed his confidence, damaging his academic reputation. Years of counseling helped him move forward, but certain triggers still sent him into emotional turmoil. The betrayal happened decades ago, yet it remained powerfully present. Goldsmith taught that you don't heal the past by reliving it or even reframing it. You heal it by recognizing it exists only in memory, which exists only in present consciousness. Right now, in this moment, there is only divine presence. The betrayed student doesn't exist now. The betrayer doesn't exist now. There is only eternal spiritual being reading these words. Thomas practiced time redemption meditation. He didn't visualize the past differently or try to send love back in time. Instead, he rested in knowing that past, present, and future all exist in eternal now, which is God's presence. From this altitude, the timeline of betrayal lost its power. He remained the same consciousness throughout all appearances of time. This is perhaps the most advanced application because it challenges everything material sense believes about causation and time. But Thomas discovered that consistent practice actually dissolved the emotional charge around those memories, not by processing or integrating, but by awakening from the dream of time altogether. He was living proof that spiritual consciousness transcends psychological healing while including it. We arrive now at total transformation, where forgiveness becomes your natural state of consciousness rather than a practice you perform. Linda had been applying Goldsmith's principles for 3 years. Gradually, she noticed something profound. She could no longer sustain grievances even when she tried. Her consciousness had so thoroughly shifted to spiritual reality that material offenses simply didn't register the same way. This isn't spiritual bypassing or emotional numbness. Linda still felt appropriate emotions and took wise action when needed. But the sticky quality of resentment had vanished. Someone could treat her unfairly and she felt momentary frustration, but it passed quickly, like clouds across sky. She no longer rehearsed injuries or built identities around her wounds. Goldsmith called this living from the mountaintop. You've climbed so high in consciousness that you see human drama from spiritual altitude. You're compassionate toward suffering, including your own, but you're not fooled into thinking it's ultimately real. You respond to the human scene while remaining anchored in divine truth. The transformation affects everyone around you without you preaching or teaching. People feel different in your presence. Conflicts dissolve more easily. Others find themselves spontaneously apologizing or changing behavior. This isn't because you're manipulating them. It's because your consciousness of their divine nature calls them to it. At this stage of practice, you understand what Jesus meant by loving your enemies. It's not straining to feel warm feelings toward those who hurt you. It's seeing so clearly into spiritual reality that the category of enemy ceases to exist. Everyone is consciousness expressing at different levels of awareness. Some are deeply asleep in material sense. Some are awakening, but all are divine life itself. This consciousness becomes a healing force in the world. You walk into tense situations and tension eases without you doing anything. You think of someone struggling and they report feeling sudden peace. This isn't magic or wishful thinking. It's the practical result of established spiritual consciousness affecting the collective consciousness field. You also discover that living from this altitude doesn't make you passive or weak. Quite the opposite. You can take strong action, speak difficult truths, and maintain firm boundaries without losing your spiritual center. The difference is you're not acting from wounded ego or personal agenda. You're acting from clarity about what serves the highest good. People often ask at this stage whether you still need to practice. Goldsmith said yes, because you're maintaining altitude, not achieving it once and for all. Just as a pilot must keep making adjustments to stay at cruising altitude, you keep returning to spiritual truth. But it becomes effortless, natural, like breathing. The ultimate revelation is that forgiveness, rightly understood, is simply another name for seeing truly. You're not forgiving the world. You're waking up from the dream that anything exists apart from divine perfection. Every person, every situation, every appearance of difficulty is simply divine reality misperceived through the lens of material sense. When you see this completely, suffering doesn't disappear from human experience, but your relationship to it transforms entirely. You respond with compassion and practical help while knowing that spiritual reality remains untouched and perfect. This paradox, holding both human tenderness and spiritual truth, is the mark of mature consciousness. You realize that Jesus' most radical teaching wasn't forgive those who hurt you. It was his underlying vision. There is only God, only divine presence, only spiritual reality. Harm, sin, evil, separation, these are all misperceptions that vanish in the light of true seeing. Forgiveness is the process of letting that light dissolve the darkness of material sense. This doesn't mean you suddenly have all the answers or never struggle. But you've found the key that unlocks every door. Whatever challenge arises, you know the response. Return to truth. Recognize presence. See beyond appearance to reality. This simple practice, applied consistently over a lifetime, transforms everything. So what happens when you truly understand the power of forgiveness Jesus taught through Joel Goldsmith's mystical lens? You discover you're not a vulnerable human trying to survive in a threatening world. You're infinite consciousness experiencing itself through a human form. Nothing can actually diminish you because what you truly are was never born and will never die. You stop collecting wounds and building an identity from your suffering. Instead, you use every difficulty as an opportunity to practice seeing from spiritual altitude. Your biography no longer defines you. Your past no longer controls you. You're free, genuinely free, in a way that most people can't even imagine. Your relationships transform because you're no longer looking to others to complete you or validate you. You're meeting them from wholeness, seeing their divinity even when they can't see it themselves. This changes the energy of every interaction. You become someone people instinctively trust and feel safe around. Your health improves because you're no longer poisoning your system with the stress chemicals of chronic resentment. Your career flourishes because you're no longer sabotaging yourself with victim consciousness. Your spiritual life deepens because you've moved beyond religion into direct experience of divine presence. You've discovered what Jesus knew and Joel Goldsmith proved. When you see truly, everything changes. If your consciousness has expanded through these Joel Goldsmith teachings on the true power of forgiveness Jesus demonstrated, like this video to help others discover spiritual freedom. Subscribe for more transformative mystical Christianity, and comment "I am transformed" to affirm your commitment to seeing with spiritual vision. Most people think living in Christ means following religious rules or attending church services. But Joel Goldsmith discovered something that changes everything. Living in Christ is not about believing in something external. It is recognizing that Christ is your own consciousness, your true identity right now. This is not theology. This is mystical reality. When you grasp this truth, your entire life shifts. You stop seeking God outside yourself. You stop begging for miracles. You recognize that the divine presence you have been searching for is the very awareness reading these words. Christ consciousness is not something you achieve. It is what you already are beneath the layers of false identity and limiting beliefs. The moment this recognition becomes real, healing begins naturally. Not because you asked for it, but because you stopped believing in the illusion of separation. Joel taught that Christ is the infinite, invisible presence that constitutes your being. When you live from this awareness, impossibilities become possibilities. Limitations dissolve. Fear loses its power over you. Here is what Joel Goldsmith meant by living in Christ. It is the continuous recognition that your consciousness is not separate from divine consciousness. Every thought, every breath, every moment is an expression of this infinite presence. You are not a human trying to reach God. You are God expressing as individual being. This changes everything about how you approach life, health, and circumstances. Traditional religion taught you to pray to God for help. Joel revealed that prayer is recognizing God as your own being. You do not ask Christ for anything. You recognize Christ as the truth of what you are. This is not arrogance. This is the highest humility, surrendering the false sense of personal self and awakening to your true spiritual identity that has always been complete. Living in Christ means you stop living from the level of effects and start living from cause. You no longer react to conditions as if they have power. You recognize that consciousness is the only power and that consciousness is what you are. From this awareness, you meet every situation with the silent knowing that nothing external can diminish or define your true being. Joel Goldsmith emphasized that Christ is not a person who lived 2,000 years ago. Christ is the eternal divine presence that was fully realized in Jesus, but exists as the true nature of every individual. When Jesus said, "I am," he was not speaking of his human personality. He was speaking from Christ consciousness, the infinite awareness that is the reality of all being. You have been conditioned to think of yourself as limited, mortal, separate. Living in Christ is waking up from that dream. It is recognizing that the I am that Jesus spoke from is the same I am that you are. Not your personality, not your history, not your body, but the infinite, invisible presence that is your true identity. This is what transforms everything. Most spiritual teachings give you something to do or achieve. Joel Goldsmith gave you something to recognize. You do not become Christ. You realize you have never been anything else. The journey is not acquiring something new, but removing the false beliefs that hide what has always been true. This recognition is not intellectual, it is experiential. And when it happens, your life begins to reflect this inner reality. What makes living in Christ different from positive thinking or affirmations? Positive thinking tries to change conditions. Living in Christ recognizes that conditions are effects, not cause. You do not try to heal the body or fix circumstances. You return to the awareness of your true nature, and from that consciousness, harmony appears. Not because you made it happen, but because you stopped empowering the illusion. Joel taught that when you live in Christ consciousness, you are living in the realm of cause rather than effect. The world sees problems and tries to solve them at the level of effect. You recognize that the only problem is the belief in separation from your true nature. When that belief dissolves in the light of recognition, what seemed like problems often dissolve as well, not through effort, but through awareness. This is why living in Christ brings such profound transformation. You are no longer at the mercy of conditions, opinions, or circumstances. You rest in the infinite invisible presence that you are. From this rest, divine order appears without struggle. This is not magic. This is the natural result of living from truth instead of illusion. And it begins the moment you stop seeking and start recognizing. Maria spent 15 years in chronic pain that doctors could not explain. She tried everything from medications to energy healing. Nothing provided lasting relief. Then she encountered Joel Goldsmith's teaching on living in Christ. At first, she thought it was just more spiritual philosophy, but something in the message struck deeper than anything she had heard before. She began practicing the recognition that Christ consciousness was her true identity. Not as a belief she tried to hold, but as a truth she returned to whenever fear or pain dominated her awareness. She would sit quietly and acknowledge that the infinite invisible presence was what she truly was, not the suffering body. This was not denial. It was a shift in identification from effect to cause. Over several weeks, something began changing. The pain did not disappear overnight, but her relationship to it transformed. She noticed that when she rested in Christ awareness, the pain lost its grip on her attention. Gradually, over 3 months, the intensity decreased. 6 months later, she was pain-free. Not because she healed her body, but because she stopped giving power to the illusion of separation. David was facing bankruptcy. His business was collapsing, and fear consumed him. Every meditation felt like begging God to save him. Then he read Joel Goldsmith's words about living in Christ as recognizing the divine presence as your own being. He realized he had been treating God as separate, as someone who might or might not help him. This was the root of his suffering. He began practicing differently. Instead of asking for rescue, he would sit in the recognition that infinite intelligence was his consciousness. Not something he hoped would help, but what he actually was. He stopped trying to fix the business from panic and started making decisions from this deeper awareness. The external circumstances did not change immediately, but his inner state transformed completely. Within 2 months, unexpected opportunities appeared. Connections materialized that seemed impossible weeks before. Within 6 months, his business had completely turned around. He understood that the change did not come from God intervening. It came from his shift in consciousness. When he stopped living from fear and limitation and started living from Christ awareness, his experience reflected that shift. Rebecca struggled with a relationship that brought continuous pain. She had tried communication techniques, therapy, and forgiveness practices. Nothing changed the pattern. Then she learned Joel Goldsmith's teaching about impersonalization through living in Christ. She realized she had been seeing the other person as the cause of her suffering, giving them power they did not actually have. She began recognizing that her peace did not depend on anyone's behavior. Christ consciousness was her true nature, untouched by external circumstances. This was not about condoning mistreatment. It was about not allowing anything external to define her inner state. She practiced returning to the awareness that she was the infinite, invisible presence, complete and whole regardless of what anyone did. The relationship did not magically become perfect, but something profound shifted. She stopped reacting from wounded ego. She made clearer decisions from inner strength. Within months, either the relationship would transform or she would have the clarity to move forward without bitterness. Living in Christ gave her freedom she had never known, not by changing the other person, but by recognizing her true nature that nothing could diminish. These stories reveal what Joel Goldsmith taught. Living in Christ is not about getting God to fix your problems. It is about recognizing that your consciousness is divine consciousness, and from that awareness, your experience transforms. Not instantly, but genuinely. Not through magic, but through the natural unfolding of living from truth instead of illusion. This is the secret that changes everything. The transformation happens gradually for most people. You practice the recognition daily. You catch yourself living from limitation and gently return to Christ awareness. You notice that over weeks and months, circumstances that seemed impossible begin shifting. Not because you manipulated reality, but because you stopped empowering illusion with your belief. This is how consciousness works when you understand what living in Christ truly means. If these transformation stories inspire you, like this video to help others find these teachings, subscribe for more Joel Goldsmith wisdom, and comment which healing journey resonated most with your heart and why it speaks to where you are now. Joel Goldsmith taught specific practices for living in Christ consciousness. The first is recognition prayer. This is completely different from petitionary prayer. You are not asking God for anything. You are recognizing that God is already present as your consciousness. You sit quietly and acknowledge this truth, not as something you hope will become true, but as the reality that is always present beneath your awareness. Recognition prayer might sound like this internally. I recognize that Christ is my true identity. I recognize that infinite wisdom is my consciousness. I recognize that divine presence is what I am, not what I seek. You are not trying to make this true. You are simply acknowledging what is already true. This shifts your entire being from seeking to resting, from lack to completeness. Practice this recognition multiple times daily, especially when fear or limitation tries to dominate your awareness. You do not need long sessions. Even 30 seconds of genuine recognition can shift your consciousness. The power is not in the length, but in the authenticity of the recognition. Are you truly acknowledging Christ as your being, or are you just repeating words? The difference determines everything. The second practice Joel emphasized is impersonalization. This means recognizing that nothing in the external world has power over your true being. When someone seems to hurt you, impersonalize it. Recognize that they are acting from their own unconsciousness, and their actions cannot touch the Christ that you are. When illness appears, impersonalize it. It is not your true nature. It is a temporary appearance in the world of effects. Impersonalization is not denial or avoidance. It is recognizing what is real and what is illusion. Your body may experience pain, but you are not the body. You are the infinite consciousness that is aware of the body. When you stop identifying with effects and rest in your true nature, the effects lose their power to dominate your experience. This takes practice, but it is the key to freedom. Start small with this practice. When something irritates you today, pause and impersonalize it. Recognize that it is not personal to your true being. Recognize that Christ consciousness is untouched by this circumstance. Even if nothing changes externally, you will feel the shift internally. That inner shift is what eventually transforms your outer experience. This is how living in Christ becomes practical rather than just theoretical. The third practice is the art of meditation that Joel called listening. Most meditation techniques involve focusing, visualizing, or repeating mantras. Joel taught something radically different. True meditation is becoming still and listening for the inner voice of Christ consciousness. You are not trying to achieve anything or go anywhere. You are simply resting in receptive awareness, allowing divine wisdom to reveal itself. This listening meditation requires patience. Your mind will wander. Thoughts will appear. You gently return to the inner listening without judgment. You are not waiting for dramatic experiences. You are cultivating the ability to hear the still small voice beneath the mental noise. This voice does not always speak in words. Sometimes it is just a sense of knowing, peace, or clarity that emerges from the silence. Practice listening meditation for at least 10 minutes daily. Sit comfortably, close your eyes, and become receptive. Do not try to make anything happen. Simply be available to divine presence. Over time, you will notice that guidance comes more clearly. Solutions appear without effort. You begin living from inner wisdom rather than mental struggle. This is living in Christ in its most practical expression. The fourth practice Joel taught is maintaining conscious awareness throughout your day. Living in Christ is not just for meditation time. It is meant to be your constant state of being. As you move through daily activities, practice remembering your true identity. When you wash dishes, remember you are Christ consciousness washing dishes. When you work, remember infinite intelligence is working through you. This continuous remembrance transforms ordinary life into spiritual practice. You are not trying to escape the world. You are bringing Christ awareness into every moment. This is how Joel lived, and this is how his students experienced profound transformation. They stopped separating spiritual time from regular time. Every moment became an opportunity to live from truth rather than illusion. Start practicing this today. Set gentle reminders to pause and recognize your true nature. When you feel stressed, return to Christ awareness. When you feel joy, recognize it as the natural state of your being. This practice gradually becomes automatic. You find yourself naturally living from consciousness rather than constantly reacting to conditions. This is when the deepest transformation occurs. The first major challenge people face is that recognition seems to fade. You have a moment of clarity where you genuinely feel Christ consciousness as your reality. Then, hours later, you are completely identified with fear or limitation again. This frustrates sincere seekers. They wonder if the recognition was real or if they are doing something wrong. Joel addressed this directly in his teachings. He explained that consciousness has layers. The surface mind is conditioned by years of false beliefs. When you first recognize your true nature, you are touching a deeper reality. But the surface conditioning does not disappear immediately. The false beliefs reassert themselves. This is not failure. This is the normal process of transformation. The key is not maintaining perfect awareness every moment, but returning to recognition each time you notice you have drifted. Think of it like learning any skill. A musician does not play perfectly the first time they touch an instrument. They practice, make mistakes, and gradually improve. Living in Christ is similar. You practice recognition, forget, remember again, forget again, remember again. Over weeks and months, the recognition becomes more stable. The periods of forgetting become shorter. This is genuine progress, even when it feels slow. The second challenge is doubt. Your mind will question whether this recognition is real or just positive thinking. When circumstances do not immediately improve, doubt becomes stronger. You wonder if Joel Goldsmith was just offering comforting philosophy with no actual power. This doubt can stop your practice entirely if you do not understand what is happening and why doubt appears in this journey. Joel taught that doubt is part of the mental conditioning being challenged. Your ego does not want you to recognize your true nature because that recognition dissolves the ego's control. So doubt appears as a defense mechanism. The way through doubt is not fighting it, but recognizing what is doubting. Your true nature never doubts itself. Only the false sense of self doubts. When doubt appears, ask who is doubting. This question shifts you back to awareness. Continue your practice even when doubt is present. Do not wait until doubt disappears to recognize your true nature. Recognize your true nature in the presence of doubt. This weakens doubt's power. Over time, you realize that doubt is just another thought appearing in consciousness. It has no more reality than any other thought. Your consistent return to recognition gradually dissolves the habit of doubting. The third challenge is isolation. When you begin living from Christ consciousness, you may feel alienated from people who live entirely from worldly concerns. Your values shift. Conversations that once seemed important now feel empty. Activities that once brought pleasure now feel hollow. This can create loneliness. Joel experienced this in his own journey and offered guidance for this passage. He taught that this phase is temporary but necessary. You are transitioning from one state of consciousness to another. During the transition, you naturally feel between worlds. The old life no longer satisfies, but the new life has not fully stabilized. The key is not forcing yourself back into old patterns that no longer fit. Instead, trust the process. Seek others who understand this path. Read spiritual teachings. Spend time in nature and meditation. As your consciousness stabilizes in truth, you will attract people who resonate with your awareness. You will find meaningful connection at a deeper level than before. The loneliness was not a sign you were wrong. It was a sign you were outgrowing limitations. Joel found a global community of seekers living from the same principles. You will find your people too. Trust the unfolding. The fourth challenge is impatience. You understand the teaching intellectually. You practice recognition faithfully. But weeks pass and your circumstances look the same. You want immediate transformation. Joel emphasized that consciousness changes precede circumstantial changes. The inner shift happens first, sometimes gradually, and then external life begins reflecting that shift. This timeline frustrates the ego that wants instant results. Remember the stories from earlier. Maria practiced for 3 months before significant pain relief. David practiced for 2 months before opportunities appeared. The recognition was working even when they could not yet see external evidence. Joel taught that your job is not producing results. Your job is maintaining the recognition. The results unfold naturally from consciousness, in perfect timing that you cannot control or predict. If these challenge-breaking techniques speak to your heart, like to support this content, subscribe for advanced spiritual practices, and comment which obstacle are you ready to transform now through living in Christ consciousness. Advanced practice of living in Christ means recognizing divine presence in every situation without exception. Joel called this practicing the presence. A student named Thomas faced a devastating diagnosis. Cancer had spread aggressively. Medical options were limited. Instead of panic, Thomas applied everything Joel taught. He recognized that his true nature was untouched by any physical condition. Christ consciousness was his reality, not the failing body. He did not deny the diagnosis or refuse treatment. He simply refused to accept it as the ultimate truth about his being. Every day he practiced recognition. Every moment fear arose, he returned to Christ awareness. He noticed something profound. The more he rested in his true nature, the less power the diagnosis had over his peace. He could face treatments without inner collapse. His doctors noticed unusual resilience and positivity. After 9 months of combining treatment with consciousness practice, scans showed dramatic improvement. After 18 months, no cancer was detectable. His doctors called it remarkable. Thomas knew what happened. He had lived from Christ consciousness so consistently that his body reflected that consciousness. This was not magic or wishful thinking. This was the natural result of consciousness being the only true power. Vanessa faced a different kind of challenge. Her adult child was struggling with addiction and repeatedly making destructive choices. As a mother, watching this brought unbearable pain. She wanted to fix, control, rescue. She tried everything from intervention to tough love. Nothing worked, and her own health began suffering from the stress and heartbreak. Then she applied Joel's teaching at a deeper level than ever before. She began impersonalizing her child's struggle. This did not mean she stopped caring. It meant she stopped believing that her child's choices defined reality or had power over the Christ consciousness that was her true nature. She practiced recognizing her child's true identity as divine consciousness, even when their behavior showed no evidence of it. She released the burden of trying to save them and trusted divine wisdom. The shift in her consciousness was profound. She found peace even while circumstances remained difficult. Interestingly, within months, her child's situation began changing. Whether this was coincidence or consciousness at work, Vanessa could not say definitively, but she knew her own transformation was real. She had learned to live in Christ regardless of external circumstances. This was the ultimate freedom Joel promised. James practiced living in Christ consciousness for years with steady but unremarkable results. Then he faced a business crisis that threatened everything he built. Partners betrayed him, lawsuits appeared, finances collapsed. This was his opportunity to discover if the recognition was real or just philosophy that worked in easy times. Joel taught that true consciousness reveals itself under pressure, not just in peaceful moments. James went deeper into recognition than ever before. Multiple times daily, he sat in meditation, acknowledging Christ as his only identity. He impersonalized the betrayal, recognizing that others' choices could not touch his true being. He listened for inner guidance about practical steps, while refusing to act from fear or vengeance. This was excruciating at times. Everything in him wanted to fight or flee, but he maintained the recognition. After 6 months of intense challenge, something remarkable happened. Solutions appeared that he never could have planned. Former enemies became unexpected allies. Financial recovery came through completely unforeseen channels. James realized he had been forced to prove to himself that consciousness truly is the only power. The crisis was not punishment, but graduation. He emerged with unshakable faith in living from Christ. Advanced living in Christ means you stop dividing life into spiritual and material. Everything becomes an expression of divine consciousness. Your work is spiritual practice. Your relationships are spiritual practice. Your finances, health, and daily activities are all opportunities to live from recognition rather than limitation. Joel demonstrated this in his own life. He was not detached from the world. He was engaged with the world from consciousness. This is where many people misunderstand mystical teaching. They think spiritual means rejecting material life. Joel taught the opposite. True spirituality transforms material life by changing the consciousness from which you live. You do not escape challenges. You meet them from Christ awareness. You do not avoid relationships. You engage in relationships from your true nature. This makes everything richer, not emptier. Practice this advanced integration. Whatever you face today, ask yourself, how would I meet this if I truly lived from Christ consciousness? Not what would Jesus do, but what would living in Christ consciousness mean right now? The answer usually involves less struggle and more trust, less force and more flow, less fear and more rest. This is the practical application of everything Joel taught. When living in Christ becomes your established consciousness, miracles become normal. Not because you are special, but because you have stopped living from limitation. Joel said that we are the law unto our own experience. When your consciousness is rooted in truth rather than illusion, your experience must reflect that truth. This is not magic. This is spiritual law operating exactly as designed. You will notice that problems dissolve before they fully form. Challenges that once would have devastated you barely register. People comment on your peace and want to know your secret. Opportunities appear without struggle. Healing happens naturally. You are not trying to make these things happen. They are the natural consequence of consciousness aligned with truth. This is what Joel meant by living by grace rather than by effort. The most profound change is inner. You know who you are, not as belief, but as living reality. You cannot be shaken by circumstances because you no longer identify with circumstances. You are the infinite, invisible presence that witnesses all circumstances, but is touched by none. This knowing brings a peace that the world cannot give or take away. This is the promise fulfilled. Joel Goldsmith's final years demonstrated total living in Christ. Even as his body weakened with age, his consciousness remained luminous. Students who visited him felt the presence that he embodied. He did not talk about living in Christ. He was the living demonstration. His last words to close students were about continuing to recognize divine presence as the only reality. He lived what he taught until his final breath. You are not meant to become Joel Goldsmith. You are meant to discover the same truth he discovered. Christ consciousness is not one person's achievement. It is the birthright of every individual willing to look beyond the false self and recognize the infinite presence that has always been their true nature. Joel was a pioneer who mapped the territory. Now you walk the path yourself. What would your life look like if you truly, deeply, consistently recognized Christ as your consciousness? What would change about how you face challenges, relate to people, approach your health, manage your finances, experience each moment? The answer to that question is what living in Christ means for you. Not theory, not philosophy, lived reality. This is what transforms everything. The teaching is simple, but requires everything from you. You must be willing to release the false identity you have defended your entire life. You must be willing to stop seeking and start recognizing. You must be willing to practice even when nothing seems to change. You must be willing to stand alone if necessary, trusting truth more than appearances. This is not easy, but it is the only path to genuine freedom. Joel never promised instant transformation. He promised that faithful practice leads to certain transformation. Consciousness is law. When you change consciousness, you must change experience. This is not belief. This is observable fact for anyone who practices with consistency. The question is not whether it works. The question is whether you will practice long enough to discover it works for yourself. Start today, right now. Not tomorrow after you finish other things. Not next week when life calms down. Now, recognize that Christ consciousness is your true identity. Feel into that recognition. Let it settle into your awareness. Return to it throughout your day. Do this for 30 days without stopping, and watch what begins shifting in your life. This is how you prove the teaching to yourself. Living in Christ is not the end of your journey. It is the beginning of living as you were designed to live. Every day brings deeper recognition. Every challenge brings opportunity to prove consciousness as the only power. Every moment is invitation to rest in your true nature rather than struggle from false identity. Joel opened a door. You must walk through it. No one can do this for you. The recognition you have discovered through this teaching is the most valuable thing you will ever find. Not because it gives you things, but because it reveals what you are. You are not limited, mortal, separate, or powerless. You are the infinite, invisible presence that Joel called Christ consciousness. When this recognition becomes your living reality, everything changes. Not because you changed the world, but because you stopped believing in the illusion. If your spiritual understanding expanded through these Joel Goldsmith secrets, like this video, subscribe for more transformative teachings, and comment "I am transformed" to confirm your commitment to living in Christ consciousness starting now. Thank you for receiving this teaching with an open heart. May you walk in the continuous recognition of your true nature. May Christ consciousness be your lived reality, not just your aspiration. May you discover the freedom that Joel Goldsmith discovered and taught. The infinite, invisible presence that you are is already complete. Recognize it. Live from it. This changes everything. Most people exhaust themselves trying to make things happen through mental willpower and physical effort. They pray desperately, affirm endlessly, visualize constantly. Believing spiritual progress requires intense doing. This becomes another form of labor that drains rather than renews. Joel Goldsmith discovered something radically different in his mystical awakening. True spiritual power emerges not from striving but from resting, not passive laziness, but conscious resting in the infinite presence that already sustains all life. This transforms everything. When you genuinely rest in God, you stop trying to manipulate reality with techniques. You cease the exhausting battle against circumstances. Instead, you learn to recognize the divine activity already present, already operating, already fulfilling itself through you without your anxious interference. This is not surrender to defeat but alignment with infinite intelligence. Resting in God means trusting the deeper power that breathes your breath, beats your heart, and orchestrates the entire universe. It changes how you approach every challenge, every desire, every moment of your existence. The teaching of resting in God contradicts everything the world teaches about achievement and success. Society conditions you to believe nothing happens without forceful action. You must push, manipulate, control, and struggle constantly. Rest seems like giving up or being irresponsible. Joel taught that this worldview creates the very problems we desperately try to solve. Constant mental effort generates anxiety, exhaustion, and resistance. You become trapped in a cycle where more trying produces less results, leading to even more frantic effort. This is the hamster wheel of human willpower. Spiritual rest breaks this destructive pattern entirely. When you rest in God, you acknowledge a power greater than personal effort. You recognize that infinite intelligence already knows your need and is already moving to fulfill it. Your job shifts from making things happen to allowing them to happen. This feels counterintuitive at first because the ego insists it must control everything. But true spiritual masters throughout history discovered the same secret. Effortless action emerges from inner stillness. Power flows through surrender to the infinite rather than assertion of the finite self. Resting in God is a specific spiritual practice, not vague positive thinking. It begins with recognizing that God, infinite consciousness, is the only power actually operating. Everything else is effect, not cause. You stop giving power to circumstances, people, conditions, or even your own thoughts. Joel would sit in meditation and consciously release all sense of personal responsibility for outcomes. He would acknowledge silently that God alone is power. God alone is presence. God alone is activity. This was not denying human participation, but recognizing the true source of all action. In this rest, something remarkable happens. The frantic mental chatter quiets. The desperate need to figure everything out dissolves. A deeper intelligence begins to surface, bringing insights, connections, and solutions that personal thinking could never manufacture. This is divine consciousness operating without obstruction. You practice this by stopping several times daily to consciously rest. Not sleep, but alert inner stillness where you cease mental effort. You release the problem to the infinite. You acknowledge the presence already here, already knowing, already acting. This practice transforms your entire relationship with life. What makes resting in God so powerful is that it opens the channel for grace to operate. Grace is unearned divine action that accomplishes what human effort cannot. But grace requires receptivity, which only comes through releasing the stranglehold of personal will and allowing infinite intelligence to work. When you truly rest in God, synchronicities multiply. The right people appear. Unexpected solutions emerge. Doors open where walls existed. This is not magic, but alignment with the universal flow that was always present, waiting for you to stop blocking it with anxious interference. Joel experienced this repeatedly in healing work. The most dramatic healings occurred when he completely released personal concern and rested in the recognition that God alone was present. The patient's consciousness opened to receive this truth, and physical transformation followed naturally without force. This rest is not passivity, but the highest activity. It is actively choosing to trust infinite intelligence over limited perception. It is consciously releasing control to the only power that truly has control. This paradoxical action through non-action becomes your new foundation for living. Robert was a business executive facing bankruptcy after market conditions destroyed his company. For months he worked 18-hour days, desperately trying to save everything through sheer effort. The harder he pushed, the worse things became. Anxiety attacks sent him to the emergency room twice. A friend introduced him to Joel Goldsmith's teachings on resting in God. Initially, Robert dismissed it as impractical mysticism. How could doing less solve problems that required immediate action? But desperation opened his mind. He began practicing conscious rest several times daily. Each morning, Robert would sit quietly and release the entire business situation to infinite intelligence. He would acknowledge that God, not personal effort, was the true source of supply and solution. This felt terrifying at first, like abandoning his responsibilities completely. But something shifted within 3 weeks. Ideas began emerging during these rest periods, fresh approaches he had never considered. A former competitor contacted him unexpectedly with a merger proposal. Clarity replaced panic. Within 6 months, his business was not just saved but thriving in ways he could never have forced. Elizabeth struggled with chronic illness for 7 years. Doctors prescribed endless treatments, but nothing produced lasting improvement. She tried every healing technique, affirmation, and visualization she could find. The constant mental effort to heal herself became another burden, adding to her suffering. When she discovered Joel's teaching on resting in God, she felt initial resistance. How could releasing effort help when she desperately needed healing? But the other approaches had failed, so she decided to experiment with this radical surrender to infinite presence. Elizabeth began each day by consciously resting in the truth that God alone is life, health, and wholeness. She stopped fighting the illness mentally and released all concern about outcomes. Instead of anxious healing visualizations, she simply acknowledged the perfect spiritual reality already present. The shift was gradual but unmistakable. Within 2 months, symptoms began subsiding without medical intervention. Within 8 months, she experienced complete recovery that baffled her physicians. The healing emerged not from personal effort, but from resting in the divine perfection that was always the truth of her being. William faced a relationship crisis that seemed impossible to resolve. His marriage was collapsing under years of accumulated resentment and communication breakdown. He had tried counseling, communication workshops, and every relationship technique available. Nothing penetrated the wall of hurt between him and his wife. Joel's teaching on resting in God offered a completely different approach. Instead of trying to fix the relationship through personal effort, William began releasing the entire situation to infinite wisdom. He stopped mentally rehearsing arguments and ceased trying to change his wife. In meditation, he would rest in the recognition that divine love is the only real presence in any relationship. He acknowledged that God, not human personalities, was the true bond between all beings. This practice required him to surrender his need to control outcomes completely. Over several months, subtle changes emerged. William found himself responding differently to conflicts, with patience replacing defensiveness. His wife noticed and began softening. Conversations that would have exploded into fights became opportunities for genuine connection. The relationship transformed not through effort, but through resting in love's infinite presence. These transformation stories reveal a consistent pattern. When people genuinely rest in God rather than struggling through personal effort, solutions emerge that human willpower could never manufacture. The key is releasing the illusion that you must make everything happen through mental force and anxious striving. This does not mean abandoning practical action. It means taking action from inner rest rather than frantic desperation. You act when guided by the still small voice within, not driven by fear and compulsion. This produces effective action without exhausting struggle. The practice requires daily commitment. You cannot rest in God occasionally when problems overwhelm you and expect miraculous results. It must become your constant inner posture, the foundation from which you meet every circumstance. Regular meditation establishes this consciousness. Joel emphasized that resting in God is recognizing what is already true, not creating something new. Infinite intelligence already operates perfectly. Divine presence already fills all space. Your rest simply removes the obstruction of personal sense that blocks awareness of this eternal reality. If these transformation stories inspire you, like this video to help others discover Joel Goldsmith's wisdom. Subscribe for more teachings on mystical consciousness, and comment which story resonated most deeply with your own spiritual journey today. Beyond the foundational practice of resting in God, Joel taught complementary techniques that deepen this consciousness. Impersonalization is essential. You must learn to stop personalizing problems, seeing them as belonging to a limited human self that must struggle and suffer through everything alone. When challenges arise, practice seeing them as impersonal world beliefs attempting to manifest through you. They are not your problems, but universal hypnotic suggestions that you can refuse to accept as truth. This removes the personal sting and opens space for divine intelligence to operate. Recognizing good as omnipresence is another vital practice. Instead of seeking good from external sources, acknowledge that infinite good already fills all space. Your rest in God allows you to perceive and receive the good that already surrounds you constantly, waiting for recognition. Joel also emphasized living by grace rather than law. Law consciousness says you must earn, deserve, and work for everything. Grace consciousness recognizes that infinite abundance flows naturally from source without human manipulation. Resting in God shifts you from law to grace automatically. The practice of listening is crucial to deepening your rest in God. Most people never truly listen for divine guidance because their minds chatter constantly with personal opinions, fears, and strategies. Real listening requires inner silence where infinite intelligence can communicate directly. Set aside time each day for pure listening without agenda. Enter meditation not to get something or solve something, but simply to be receptive to whatever infinite wisdom wishes to reveal. This listening stance is itself a form of resting in God. During this listening, do not expect dramatic voices or visions. Divine guidance often comes as gentle knowing, subtle insight, or quiet certainty that emerges from the silence. You begin to sense the right action, the perfect timing, the necessary next step without mental struggle. Joel received his deepest revelations during these listening periods when he completely surrendered personal seeking. The infinite would pour wisdom through him that transformed not only his consciousness, but thousands who heard his teachings. This same channel opens for you through devoted listening. Practicing the presence is Joel's signature teaching that perfectly complements resting in God. Throughout your day, pause regularly to acknowledge the infinite presence here, now, in this exact moment. Not a distant God you must reach, but presence already fully present as your very being. You can practice presence anywhere, anytime. Waiting in traffic, acknowledge presence here. Facing a difficult conversation, recognize presence here. Feeling anxious or afraid, return to presence here. This simple practice grounds you in the eternal now where God actually exists. The more you practice presence, the more naturally you rest in God. You realize you are never separate from infinite intelligence, never outside divine care, never abandoned to personal resources alone. Presence becomes your refuge, your strength, your constant source. This transforms mundane moments into spiritual practice. Washing dishes, acknowledge presence. Walking to your car, feel presence. Every activity becomes an opportunity to deepen your consciousness of the infinite here and now, dissolving the illusion of separation that creates all struggle. Releasing attachment to outcomes is perhaps the most challenging aspect of resting in God. Your ego desperately wants specific results in specific time frames. It believes it knows what should happen and when. This attachment blocks the greater good that infinite intelligence wishes to manifest. True rest requires surrendering your pictures of how things should be. You maintain vision and direction, but hold them loosely, allowing infinite wisdom to fulfill them in ways beyond your limited imagination. Often the manifestation exceeds anything you could have designed yourself. Joel taught that clinging to desired outcomes actually pushes them away. Your attachment creates energetic resistance that blocks natural flow. When you release into trust, acknowledging that infinite intelligence knows the perfect unfoldment, you open channels for grace to operate freely. Practice this release daily. Whatever concerns you, consciously surrender it to infinite wisdom. Affirm your trust that the highest good is already unfolding perfectly. Then rest in that confidence, taking inspired action when guided but releasing anxious manipulation. This is spiritual maturity. The primary obstacle to resting in God is the conditioned belief that you must control everything through personal effort. This conditioning runs deep, reinforced by family, education, society, and past experiences. Breaking free requires recognizing these patterns and consciously choosing differently. When you first attempt to rest in God, the mind often rebels violently. It insists you are being irresponsible, lazy, or naive. Anxiety floods in, demanding you take charge immediately. These reactions reveal how identified you are with the false sense of being a separate controller. The solution is gentle persistence. You do not fight these reactions, which only strengthens them. Instead, acknowledge them compassionately while continuing to practice rest. Over time, as you witness the superior results of divine intelligence, the mind naturally releases its desperate grip on control. Joel emphasized that this transition takes time. You have decades of conditioning to undo. Be patient with yourself. Celebrate small victories when you successfully rest through a challenge. Gradually, resting in God becomes more natural than anxious striving, though the old patterns may still surface occasionally. Another common obstacle is misunderstanding rest as passivity. People fear that resting in God means doing nothing while life falls apart around them. This confusion keeps many from experiencing the profound power of this practice. True spiritual rest is not inaction but action from a higher source. When you rest in God, you still take action in the world. You still fulfill responsibilities, make decisions, and engage with life fully. The difference is the source of your action. Instead of acting from fear, compulsion, and ego-driven willpower, you act from inner guidance and peace. This produces far more effective action than frantic effort ever could. Action from rest is focused, timely, and aligned with universal intelligence. You do less but accomplish more, because divine wisdom directs your steps rather than confused human thinking. Joel would often say that one action taken from consciousness of God accomplishes what 1,000 human efforts cannot. This is because God-directed action carries infinite power behind it, while personal effort relies on limited human resources. Rest opens you to unlimited power. Doubt is perhaps the subtlest obstacle to resting in God. Even when intellectually convinced, you may harbor unconscious doubt about whether infinite intelligence truly cares about your specific situation. This doubt creates resistance that blocks the full demonstration of divine power in your experience. Address doubt through honest acknowledgement rather than denial. When doubt arises, admit it openly to yourself and to God. Then consciously choose to trust anyway, not because you feel certain, but because you recognize the futility of trusting limited human perception instead. Joel taught that faith is not believing despite evidence, but recognizing the greater reality beyond appearances. When doubt says nothing is happening, faith rests in the invisible activity of infinite intelligence already at work. This faith deepens through practice and witnessing results over time. Build your faith gradually through small demonstrations. Practice resting in God with minor concerns first. As you witness divine intelligence operating effectively in small matters, your confidence grows to trust it with larger challenges. Faith develops experientially, not through intellectual conviction alone. The obstacle of impatience can sabotage your practice of resting in God. You want instant results because your mind operates in limited time frameworks. But infinite intelligence works according to divine timing, which often differs from human preferences. Learning to rest in this timing is crucial. When you demand immediate manifestation, You actually interfere with the perfect unfoldment already occurring. Your impatience creates tension that blocks natural flow. True rest includes resting in divine timing, trusting that everything emerges at exactly the right moment for maximum benefit. Joel emphasized that premature manifestation can actually harm you. Infinite wisdom knows when you are ready to receive, when circumstances are perfectly aligned, when the blessing will produce maximum good. Your impatience comes from limited perception that cannot see the bigger picture. Practice surrendering your timeline along with everything else. Affirm that divine timing is perfect timing. Notice how things often work out better than if they had happened when you desperately wanted them. This builds trust in the wisdom of delays and the perfection of divine scheduling. If these obstacle-breaking insights resonate with your journey, like to support this transformative content, subscribe for advanced Joel Goldsmith teachings, and comment which obstacle you are ready to release through resting in God today. Advanced practitioners of resting in God learn to maintain this consciousness during intense challenges. When crisis strikes, the natural human response is to abandon spiritual practice and resort to frantic effort. But this is precisely when resting in God becomes most powerful and necessary. Kenneth faced this test when his teenage son was hospitalized with a life-threatening condition. Every parental instinct screamed at him to panic, to demand answers, to control the situation through sheer willpower. Instead, he consciously chose to rest in the truth that God alone is life. During the most terrifying nights, Kenneth would sit beside his son's hospital bed and silently acknowledge divine presence as the only power present. He released his terror to infinite wisdom, trusting the perfect unfoldment even when appearances screamed disaster. This required every ounce of spiritual discipline he had developed. His son recovered completely over several weeks, defying medical predictions. The doctors called it miraculous. Kenneth knew it as the natural result of resting so completely in God that divine perfection could manifest without the interference of parental fear and desperate mental manipulation. Carol discovered that resting in God transforms daily work from drudgery into spiritual practice. As a nurse working long shifts in a demanding hospital environment, she had always felt drained and overwhelmed by the endless needs surrounding her constantly. She began practicing Joel's teaching by consciously resting in God at the start of each shift. Instead of believing she personally must heal, help, and fix everyone through her own limited energy, she acknowledged that divine intelligence was the true healer working through her. During patient interactions, she would silently rest in the recognition that God alone was present in both her and the patient. She released personal responsibility for outcomes while fulfilling her medical duties impeccably. This paradoxical combination produced remarkable results consistently. Patients sensed something different in her presence. Healing accelerated. Difficult situations resolved smoothly. Yet Carol felt energized rather than depleted at shift end. She had discovered the secret of effortless effort, action flowing from rest in infinite source rather than limited personal resources. Brian applied resting in God to creative work with stunning results. As a struggling writer facing constant rejection and creative blocks, he had exhausted himself trying to force inspiration through willpower. Writing became torture rather than joy, and his work reflected this struggle. When he learned to rest in God before writing sessions, everything changed. He would sit in silence, releasing all concern about outcomes, quality, or success. He acknowledged that infinite intelligence was the true source of all creativity, and his job was simply to be a clear channel. From this rest, words would flow effortlessly in ways that amazed him. Ideas emerged fully formed that his personal thinking could never have manufactured. The writing itself became meditation, a continuous resting in divine mind expressing through him without obstruction or effort. Within a year of this practice, Brian published his first novel to critical acclaim. But more importantly, he had discovered that true creativity emerges from rest, not struggle. The infinite has unlimited ideas waiting to express through anyone willing to release personal interference. The most advanced application of resting in God is maintaining this consciousness in relationships. Nancy discovered this when her adult daughter's choices created painful family conflict. Every instinct urged Nancy to intervene, control, fix, and force resolution, through maternal willpower and guilt. Instead, she practiced resting in the truth that God alone was the true parent of her daughter. She released her daughter completely to infinite wisdom, acknowledging that divine intelligence loved her child infinitely more than human love ever could, and knew the perfect path. This rest did not mean abandoning her daughter or refusing to help when asked. It meant releasing the desperate need to control her daughter's journey. Nancy maintained loving contact without manipulation, offered support without demands, and trusted the divine unfoldment even through painful circumstances. Over 2 years, her daughter's life transformed in ways Nancy could never have forced. The relationship healed profoundly because Nancy had released control and rested in the truth that infinite love was already caring for her child perfectly. This is the ultimate demonstration of resting in God. When you genuinely understand what resting in God means, your entire existence transforms at the deepest level. You stop living from the exhausting illusion that you personally must make everything happen through anxious effort and constant mental manipulation of circumstances and people. You realize that infinite intelligence is already present, already operating, already fulfilling itself perfectly. Your role shifts from desperate doer to conscious witness and willing instrument. You participate fully in life, but from rest rather than from frantic striving. This does not mean all challenges disappear. It means you meet every challenge from a foundation of peace, knowing that greater wisdom than personal thinking is already addressing every situation. Problems lose their power to disturb your inner equilibrium because you rest in eternal presence. Joel taught that this consciousness is not achieved through years of difficult spiritual practice. It is recognized in this very moment through simple acknowledgement of what is already true. God is here now. Infinite intelligence is operating now. Perfect presence fills this moment completely. The fruit of resting in God is a life of grace where synchronicity becomes normal. You stop manufacturing your good through manipulation and instead recognize the good already flowing toward you from infinite source. This completely transforms your experience of abundance in every area. Supply appears from unexpected directions because you have released the limiting belief that it can only come through specific channels. Health manifests naturally because you have stopped fighting illness and rested in the truth of spiritual wholeness. Relationships harmonize because you have released control. This is not magical thinking, but practical mysticism. When you align with the infinite flow rather than resisting it through personal will, you open channels for grace to operate freely. What seemed impossible through effort becomes natural through rest. Joel demonstrated this throughout his life. He never marketed his teachings or sought recognition, yet thousands found him. He never charged for healing work, yet abundance flowed constantly. He lived from rest in God, and infinite intelligence managed every detail perfectly. Maintaining your consciousness of resting in God requires daily spiritual practice. This is not burden but joy, returning to the well of infinite peace that sustains and renews you. Without this daily return to Source, you gradually slip back into the exhausting illusion of personal responsibility. Create sacred time each morning and evening for conscious rest. Sit in silence and release everything to infinite wisdom. Acknowledge the presence here now. Listen for the still small voice. Let divine intelligence fill your consciousness until you feel the deep peace that passes understanding. Throughout your day, practice returning to this rest whenever you notice anxiety or struggle arising. The moment you feel yourself trying to force outcomes through personal will, pause and consciously release into God. This constant returning establishes rest as your natural state. Joel emphasized that spiritual consciousness must be renewed daily, just as the body requires daily food. You cannot rest in God once and expect the consciousness to sustain itself automatically. Daily practice keeps the channel open and your awareness clear. You now understand what happens when you truly grasp what resting in God means. It transforms you from anxious striver to peaceful instrument, from desperate controller to willing channel, from exhausted doer to conscious witness of infinite intelligence, operating through you effortlessly. This is not theology, but practical reality that changes every moment of your existence. When you rest in God, you access unlimited wisdom, boundless creativity, and infinite power that your personal thinking could never manufacture. Life flows rather than being forced. Begin practicing today. Right now, consciously release whatever concerns you most to infinite wisdom. Acknowledge that God alone is power, presence, and activity. Rest in this truth until you feel the deep peace of surrendering control to the only intelligence that truly has control. Joel Goldsmith pioneered this mystical Christianity for modern seekers. His teachings on resting in God offer the key to transformation that religions promise but rarely deliver. You have received this wisdom. Now live it daily, and watch your entire world transform from the inside out. If your spiritual understanding has expanded through these Joel Goldsmith revelations, like this video to spread this transformative wisdom, subscribe for more mystical Christianity teachings, and comment, "I rest in God," to affirm your commitment to this new consciousness today.